Today, we have this strange, made for Hollywood, and indeed it was made for Hollywood, tale of a universally beloved assistant funeral director, Bernie Tiede. A kind, overly generous man, Bernie ingratiated himself in the community of Carthage, Texas, and he made the unlikely friendship of a very wealthy widow named Marjorie Nugent. What started out as a dream turned into a nightmare that captivated the entire town of Carthage, a Texas Monthly reporter, and Jack Black. Welcome to Margs and Mayhem, where I tell you a true crime story and we drink. The following content may be disturbing to some. Discretion is advised. If you choose to enjoy one of our themed margaritas, make sure you are of legal drinking age and have fun, but drink responsibly. I hope you all survived what was undoubtedly my longest episode of Margs and Mayhem probably ever. I don't know why polygamous cults are my passion project, but there you have it. Today's episode is not that much shorter, I hate to break it to you. And we're heading to the state of my residence, Texas. And we're going to use the state fruit of Texas, the grapefruit, as the star of today's margarita. Things have gotten a little bit chillier here in the state of Texas over the last week or so. So we're gonna go with an on the rocks margarita. Not that that makes that much of a difference from a frozen drink. I mean, maybe I should try experimenting with a warm margarita. You know what? That sounded gross the second it came out of my mouth. So forget I said that. The grapefruit margarita starts with 1 part lime juice. To that, we'll add 1 part tequila, 1 part triple sec, and 2 parts of a grapefruit vodka. Couple of things you could change here. You could add a part of simple syrup if you wanted it to be a little sweeter, or you could use a grapefruit liqueur instead of a grapefruit vodka. But you're in Texas at least, grapefruit vodka, pretty easy to find. So we shake it up in our shaker and then we strain it over bougie fresh ice. Truth be told, I'm not much of a grapefruit fan. I find it too bitter. So for this drink, I did go ahead and use a sugar rim, and it really does help. And it's also quite pretty, don't you think? All right, let's get down to business. Funeral business. Bernhard Tiede II was born on August 2nd, 1958 in Tyler, Texas. His parents were Bernhard Sr. and Lila Mae Jester. Bernhard Sr. was actually an immigrant from Russia, and in his later years was a choral professor at colleges around Texas. And as is pretty common for people in the music profession, he was also a church choir director, and he had a pretty nice singing voice, so he was a featured soloist. Bernie Jr., it seems, inherited his talent for music. More on that later. Before we continue, just a quick note that Tiede is actually the way that I've heard Bernie pronounce his own last name. There's a lot of people that pronounce it in different ways, but we're gonna go with the way that Bernie pronounces his own name. Anyway, back to the story. Lila Mae was tragically killed in a car accident when Bernie was between 2 and 3 years old. Bernie would later say that his father was driving the car and he never really forgave himself for Lila Mae's death. That would cause him to turn to alcohol to drown his sorrows, something that would end his short life. Sorry, foreshadowing. Pretty soon after, when Bernie was about 5 years old, Bernhard Sr. remarried, and he and his wife, Clara, had another child, Bernie's half-sister. When Bernie was 15 years old, his father died, probably due to alcoholism. And in an effort to support both his stepmother and his half-sister, he actually took a part-time job at a funeral home. He started out doing odd jobs outside lawn work, and then eventually he started helping out with actual funerals. And strange though it may seem, it appears that Bernie really found his calling in doing that. Bernie's sister would later say that this seemed to be a job that he was destined to do. He really just loved helping people, and especially people who were in the midst of grieving a family member. Well, it possibly could have been due to the losses that he faced as a child. At this time, the family was living in Abilene, Texas, and Bernie was a popular student at Cooper High School, and he was known to borrow the hearse on Friday nights to drive his sister and their friends around town. Honestly, that kind of seems like a fun time. Bernie graduated from high school in 1976, and then he enrolled at McNeese State University, which is in Lake Charles, Louisiana, and he chose to study mortuary science. Mortuary. I'm never going to get that right, so mortuary science. Fun fact, did not know that it was possible for you to have a degree in mortuary science, but you can. It's typically an associate's degree, which is what Bernie studied for, but you can also get a bachelor's degree in mortuary science, or if you want to be really educated, you can actually become a doctor in thanamatology, which is the study of the science of death. So you could be Dr. Death if you wanted to. Anyway, back to mortuary science. Mortuary. Bernie studied that and got his associate's degree. The degree both involves the science of death and what you would do with a body after death, embalming and the stuff you do for a funeral, and also involves some of the social science, so dealing with bereaved families, as well as some elements of managing a business, because you can manage a funeral home. I mean, honestly, it sounds pretty interesting. Not for me, but for some people, and for Bernie, it seemed to be a calling. After graduating from McNeese State with his associate's degree, Bernie stuck around for a few years, acting as a funeral director at one of the local funeral homes, until he took a job in 1985 in Carthage, Texas, at Hawthorne Funeral Home. He packed up his things and moved. It was about 3 hours from Lake Charles and about 5 hours from his hometown of Abilene. He moved into an apartment behind the funeral home and started taking in an annual salary of $18,000 a year, which is about $45,000 a year in today's money. As is typical and annoying about cases such as this, we tend to know a lot more about the background and upbringing of one side of the equation, Bernie, than we do about the other. But I think it's safe to say that Marjorie's trajectory was a lot different from Bernie's. Born in 1915 to a grocery store owner, Marjorie Nugent at the time grew up just outside of Carthage, Texas. Despite the 1930s sentiment that women should really focus on getting married and not go in college, because going to college really delayed the prime years of being able to get married, Marjorie went to school at Louisiana Tech University, and, defying the odds, that's actually where she met her husband. R.L. Nugent, or Rod, was a recent alumni of the college, and they got married, and they would end up having one son together. Pretty early on in his career, Rod made the wise decision to take a job with Magnolia Oil, which is now Mobil. Pretty smart. In 1989, as they neared retirement, Marjorie and Rod decided to move back to Marjorie's hometown, Carthage. They bought a property and built a 6,000 square foot state-of-the-art house surrounded by a tall stone fence. They bought the controlling shares in the First National Bank of Carthage, which literally meant they owned a bank. Let's just say the Nugents were pretty wealthy. And when Rod died in 1990, 75-year-old Marjorie was an incredibly wealthy woman. And she was pretty universally disliked in the community of Carthage. For one, she was barely seen outside of her house at all, but that didn't stop the rumor mill from churning, now did it? She didn't go to church. Gasp. She didn't participate in any of those civic activities that all the little old ladies of Carthage participated in. She was estranged from her sister, who also happened to live in Carthage, and she barely spoke to her son over disagreements. At least this is what people in the town told each other. When she did manage to leave her house to go to the bank, for example, she would sit in the lobby and not even nod a greeting to the people who walked in. That, my friends, is a cardinal sin in the state of Texas. Oh, and despite the fact that she was a millionaire, she was not generous. She did not give her money to causes for the town, and she once even haggled over a $45 bill with a veterinarian. Suffice it to say, not too popular in the town. To the people of Carthage, she was at the very least a snob, somebody who didn't care one lick for people in the community. As one member would say, quote, "If she had held her nose any higher, she would have drowned in a rainstorm," end quote. But some would say it went beyond general elitism. Her stockbroker, Lloyd Tiller, would later say that she had a pretty famous temper. She was known to throw temper tantrums when she didn't get her way. Yes, as a 75-year-old woman. Her sister would later say that she was even a little bit afraid of her own sister because of her temper and the fits that she would throw. For what it's worth, there are a few people that really dispute this view and picture of Marjorie Nugent. Her granddaughters have fond memories of her working in the garden, canning, being a real woman of her generation. But in general, the community of Carthage, not huge fans of Marjorie Nugent. I'd probably argue that the truth is somewhere in the middle. You know how rumors are, especially in small towns, and granddaughters tend to put some rose-colored glasses on when it comes to talking about their grandmother. And honestly, these two things aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. She could have been both kind and loving with her granddaughters and not very nice in the general community, but I guess we'll never know. One thing we do know for sure is that Bernie Tiede was a universally beloved member of the community of Carthage, Texas. He was pretty well known. He participated actively in the First United Methodist Church, including singing in the choir and being a featured soloist. Again, he inherited some of his father's musical talents. He was known to fill in for the preacher when the preacher was sick or out of town, and some members of the congregation thought he was better than the paid preacher. He was a portly fellow with a pretty big, well-manicured mustache, and I think a lot of the women in town would have been eager to date such an eligible bachelor in his early 30s. But the truth is, it was a pretty well-known secret in Carthage that Bernie was gay. They would say light in his loafers. But the people of Carthage didn't really care, and this was small town Texas in the 1990s. Small town, very conservative Texas in the 1990s. It speaks a lot to Bernie's generous spirit. Speaking of his generous spirit, he was known to give gifts with wild abandon to the people in town. In fact, he so much gave gifts that the UPS truck was often at his house daily, which is a pretty unusual sight in the 1990s. Imagine what damage he could have done with Amazon. He also became involved with the music and theater departments of Panola College, which was the community college in Carthage. They noticed that he had a pretty extensive knowledge of Broadway musicals, and he even conducted several of the Broadway musicals that they performed at the college. In March of 1990, Bernie Tiede met Marjorie Nugent when she arrived at the Hawthorne Funeral Home to make arrangements for her husband's funeral. You see, as good as Bernie was at singing, he was even better at funerals. The owner of Hawthorne's funeral home, Don Lipsey, would say, quote, "Bernie was probably the most qualified young man I have ever seen. He waited well on the families. He would sing solos behind the screen during the funeral, and he was a darned good embalmer. He had a talent of making the hair of the deceased look really natural," end quote. Sorry. He was also known to keep tabs on the elderly women who had recently become widows in the town of Carthage. He would check on them, make sure they were doing okay, transitioning into life alone. He would mow their lawns, run errands for them. It just was a part of who Bernie was as a person. And so that's what he did for Marjorie. And as unlikely of a pairing as it may seem, Marjorie and Bernie became fast friends. It seems like some of the only kindness that Marjorie Nugent had received in years, or maybe even at all, from the people of Carthage. He made her smile, and they had good conversation. Marjorie really took a liking to him. She gave him a Rolex watch, and slowly but surely, he started doing more for Marjorie, sort of acting as her business manager. He was even given permission to sign her checks at the bank and withdraw money from her account. Marjorie insisted upon it with the bank. And they also did social events together. They went on cruises. She both paid for the cruise and paid Bernie to go on the cruise with her. And let's be honest, she could afford it. She was making between $400,000 and $600,000 a year on royalty payments from the oil company alone. She had a lot of money that she wanted to spend, and she didn't mind spending it on Bernie. And at least according to one Carthage resident, she was prepared to spend all of that money. He would say, quote, "She told me very clearly that she intended to enjoy the rest of her life. She said, 'I'll spend every dime before I leave it to my family,' end quote." In fact, it wasn't long before she changed her entire will, leaving all of her fortune to be given to Bernie in her death. Yikes. Bernie left his job at the funeral home and took a pretty sizable raise to work for Marjorie in an official capacity as her business manager and some other things. Things kind of got weird kind of fast. So he would arrive first thing in the morning to make her coffee. He would do weird things like trim her toenails. Yeah. Pretty quickly, he buys a house that's only 2 miles from Marjorie's house so that he can arrive quickly. They travel the world together. They go to Egypt, to China, to New York City to watch new Broadway musicals. He convinced her to start going to church at the First United Methodist Church. Seems like Bernie and Marjorie were living the dream. But all good things must come to an end, and the dream began to sour. Marjorie became increasingly controlling over Bernie's life. If he didn't arrive right on time, she would become very angry, throw a temper tantrum. If Bernie left Marjorie for any period of time, he would need to call her frequently to check in, or she would rapidly page him on his pager. Those of you that are older than 20 probably remember pagers, but she would page him constantly. In order to avoid getting in trouble, he'd even leave a choir practice early or call her in the middle of it to check in. But to be honest, Bernie was not acting in a way that would garner him sainthood either. You see, if you remember, Bernie had been given permission to access Marjorie's bank accounts, and he started to do that. Without any of her knowledge, he started giving away lots of money. He gave away at least 10 cars to people in the city of Carthage. He promised $100,000 to the First United Methodist Church to build a new wing of the church. He funded the opening of a boot scootin' western wear, which was Carthage's answer to Neiman Marcus in their downtown. And he loaned all kinds of people all kinds of Marjorie's money without her even noticing. But despite the fact that the relationship was souring, Bernie refused to leave. He would tell others that he felt obligated to stay with her. He was her only friend, and he felt like he needed to be with her. I am halfway done with my margarita, and this paragraph is what's gonna make me finish it, if that's any indication of what's to come. In November of 2006, things came to a head. Marjorie had asked Bernie to buy a .22 caliber rifle in order to shoot armadillos that were coming into the yard. Bernie would later say that Marjorie was showing some signs of mental illness and possibly dementia, but it would be Bernie that would take that rifle and shoot Marjorie Nugent in the back 4 times. she was dead pretty quickly. And he then drug her body to the chest-sized deep freezer, removed the Marie Callender's pot pies, and wrapped her in a white Land's End sheet and put her into that deep freezer right above the frozen salmon. He put the Marie Callender pies back in and he taped that sucker shut. And then for 9 months, Bernie pretended that Marjorie was still alive. Yep, another one of those. He made up a series of lies. For a while, she was visiting her other sister that didn't live in Carthage. For a while, she was in a nursing home. For a time, she was in a hospital in Temple, recovering from a stroke, where she didn't want to talk to anybody, and she entered using an assumed name. Okay. And Bernie also continued to spend her money to the tune of at least $850,000, although there are some claims that it's even more than that. He acted like his Marjorie's still alive, perfectly generous and loving self. And why was he able to get away with this? Remember, nobody in town liked Marjorie. She was estranged from her sister. There weren't any coffee dates for her to miss or any times where she should have been in Sunday school and she wasn't. People just, they didn't care that she was gone. That was until one resident of Carthage did eventually call the police and say, have you heard from Marjorie? Have not seen Marjorie around town in quite some time. So the authorities do call Marjorie's son and the granddaughters, and they come to help the police search the house. They come upon this freezer, which had been taped shut, which is, it's pretty suspicious to tape shut a deep freezer. So they untaped it and found her under the pot pies in the Land's End sheet. The authorities would unplug the freezer and load it whole into a pickup truck and plug it into a generator to keep it frozen and transport it to Dallas for an autopsy, where it would take 2 full days for Marjorie Nugent to thaw in order for them to be able to complete their autopsy. You have my permission to drain your margarita and pour yourself a second. That's what I did. When the authorities got to Bernie, he first clung to his lies and then quickly admitted that he had been the one to kill Marjorie. He felt trapped, he said. He didn't think that he had any way out. And why did he keep her in the freezer for 9 months? Well, like the true funeral home director, mortician that he was, he had wanted to give her a proper burial. And then the entire town of Carthage, Texas, totally rallied behind this guy. An actual admitted murderer. They baked him pies and visited him in jail. They gathered together enough money to bail him out. This was only counteracted when the prosecutors added additional charges of stealing Marjorie's money in order to keep him in jail until the trial. The town was ready to spring him. For one of the only times in basically criminal justice history, prosecutor Danny Buck Davidson, yes, his name was Danny Buck, Danny Buck requested and was granted a change of venue. Not because the defendant wouldn't get a fair trial because everybody in the area hated them or loved the victim, but because they loved the defendant so much that the prosecutor didn't think he could get a fair trial. And the change of venue was granted. Wild. Despite the defense by his defense attorney, Clifton Scrappy Holmes, yes, he went by Scrappy, Bernie Tiede was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to 50 years in prison. And now, this is where things get weird. Yes, now this is where things get weird. Richard Linklater, Heard of him? Probably. He's a pretty famous Texas-based director that's directed films like Boyhood and Dazed and Confused. Well, he read a January 1998 article written by Skip Hollandsworth, and he, like so many others, were fascinated by this tale of a beloved, kind, generous, church-going man who murdered a woman in cold blood and hid her in a freezer, spent all her money. So he decided to write a movie. So he and Skip wrote the screenplay together, and then in 2011, Richard Linklater directed the movie Bernie. It starred Jack Black as Bernie, Shirley MacLaine as Marjorie Nugent, and Matthew McConaughey as prosecutor Danny Buck. Richard and Jack actually visited Bernie several times in prison, to get fodder for the movie, and they were equally enamored by him. You see, Bernie, even in prison, was a model prisoner. He spent his spare time cross-stitching memorials for people who had lost relatives. You cannot make this stuff up. At the premiere of the movie in Austin, a defense attorney named Jodi Cole approached Richard Linklater. You see, she wanted to take on the case. She, like so many others, couldn't understand why such a mild-mannered, kind person as Bernie would murder someone in cold blood. And she wanted to help Bernie out. She couldn't believe that Bernie didn't commit this crime unless there was some kind of justifiable reason. And she thought she found one. You see, Bernie finally admitted that he'd actually been sexually molested by an uncle when he was a teenager. And so she found a psychologist who believed that Bernie had been in a dissociative state during the murder of Marjorie. He'd kept all of his emotions pent up from what had happened with his uncle those years before, until the abuse from Marjorie just made it more than he could stand, and he had a break from reality and killed Marjorie. Well, the judge granted him a new sentencing hearing. Not a new trial, but a new trial for sentencing only. And also, he granted him parole while he was waiting. And so Bernie Tiede moved into the garage apartment of the director of Bernie, the movie, Richard Linklater, in Austin, Texas. While he was out, he got himself a pet parakeet. He started going to church at the local Methodist church, and he went to therapy once a week. The resentencing trial happened, and after only 4 hours, Bernie Tiede was actually resentenced to 99 years in prison. Although he will be eligible for parole. So what do you think? Was Bernie a good guy who made a big mistake? Or did he have a dissociative episode because of something that had happened to him 20 years prior in his childhood? Or was he really just into the money of Marjorie Nugent? Was he trapped, or was he trapped by his own mistakes? Or was Marjorie just evil? A tantrum-throwing, controlling, evil woman who deserved to die at the hands of Bernie Tiede. While it is possible for a person to have one dissociative episode, it seems unlikely to me that Bernie had one dissociative episode, and that's the one where he shot his friend. What I do think happened is that Bernie got caught up in it all. He was a mortician, making $45,000 a year fixing dead people's hair. And suddenly, he's traveling the world. He's buying himself a brand new house. He's seeing Broadway shows. And he's able to be generous with real money, which is something that he had always wanted to do. The problem is, it wasn't his money. And the truth is, it doesn't matter if Marjorie Nugent was universally hated and Bernie Tiede was universally loved, or if it was the other way around. It doesn't matter if someone is difficult to love. They don't deserve to be shot. They don't deserve to be killed, and they don't deserve to be shoved in a freezer. I agree with the juries. Bernie Tiede was guilty of murder, and he should serve his time in prison. That is what he deserves. You can't kill somebody, no matter how you feel about them or how trapped you feel. And if you do, you gotta go to jail. You just do. Bernie Tiede remains incarcerated at the John B. Connolly Unit of the Texas Department of Corrections in Kennedy, Texas. He'll be eligible for parole in 2029, when he's 71 years old. Unlike last week's case, I actually do think he will be granted parole. Who knows? Maybe he'll move back into Richard Linklater's apartment above his garage, and I'll see him walking around the neighborhood that I used to live in. You can't make this stuff up. Bernie's half-sister has done some interviews over the years and testified in Bernie's trials, but she prefers to remain anonymous. I mean, who can blame her? As of 1998, she was a social worker in Central Texas. In 2011, Marjorie's sister met Shirley MacLaine after a Fort Worth performance of Shirley's one-woman show, An Evening with Shirley MacLaine. They hugged each other for a very long time. Neither one of them sang any words. And Marjorie Nugent did get her proper burial outside of Carthage, Texas. Her granddaughter sang Amazing Grace at the funeral. Before we go, I'd like to give my thanks to Skip Hollingsworth. He's the one that wrote that article in Texas Monthly that got Richard Linklater and Jack Black involved in this story. It's called Midnight in the Garden of East Texas. It's tremendous. I'll link it in the description box, and he's done a follow-up, which I highly encourage you to read as well. Marjorie Nugent's granddaughters strongly object to their grandmother's portrayal in that 2011 movie Bernie, but I do actually recommend that you watch it, just keeping that in mind. Some people say that it's Jack Black's finest performance, and I haven't seen all of Jack Black's movies, but honestly, I wouldn't argue with them. Thanks for hanging out with me. Gotta say, I've been a big fan of this really fascinating crime and the surprisingly delicious drink. It's fairly refreshing. I might have to try it frozen during this summer. I imagine myself drinking it and grooving to my new theme song. It's pretty great, don't you think? Well, let me know what you think. Head over to social media. One of my videos last week got a little bit of attention on the Clock app, so be sure to check it out. Remember, I do 60-second versions of these crimes if your attention span is 60 seconds long. Next week, we're trying something a little different. Some of you may know that missing and murdered Indigenous women in the United States and Canada is a true human rights crisis. Over the course of this season, I'll be covering several of these cases in the hopes of spreading the word using my platform. And for these episodes, I'm going to be focusing on the crime and not the margarita. Now, I know that some of you come just for the margarita recipe, although I hope that's not a lot of you. So for those of you that are really into that, I will put the classic margarita recipe in the description box for those weeks. And just so you know, I pretty much riff off of the classic margarita using different ingredients like the grapefruit vodka every week anyway. So you can use that base recipe to experiment on your own if you'd like for these weeks. The crime for next week is the incredibly suspicious case of Sarah Stopp's Pretty Places, an 18-year-old woman who was murdered in Montana in 2019, and a case that remains unsolved and uninvestigated to this day. I hope you'll join me to listen, learn, and do some activism where we can. I'll see you next week, and remember, there are always alternatives to murdering your best friend and throwing her in the freezer.